Hello and welcome to this Cybercrime Academy video podcast. Today I'm joined by Sophie Mortimer, who's the helpline manager for the Revenge Porn Helpline, which is an organisation that works with victims of intimate image abuse. Sophie, would you tell us a little bit more about your organisation and the work that you do, please?
The Revenge Porn Helpline was founded in 2015 and I joined the following year. We were set up around the same time that it became a criminal offence to disclose private images with the intention of causing distress. The organisation that runs this is Southwest Grid for Learning, who are part of the UK Safer Internet Centre. So been long time big players in the world of online safety, particularly aimed at children and schools. And we've just grown out of some of their other work and we're the best people at the time to run that helpline. So here we are. And if you want to know what we do, we offer some advice about legal options and going to the police for people that contact us. And of course, that will depend on their particular situation. We'll talk them through what it's like reporting to the police, what evidence it would be helpful if they had, and what that experience is like, because it in all honesty, it's not always great for people reporting to the police in anything. These sorts of areas, so it's good to be as prepared as possible. So we'll talk about screenshots, preserving links, and maybe creating a timeline of events if that's an appropriate thing to do. And then we'll talk to them about reporting any content that's online. So sometimes people would like to deal with reporting that and removing it themselves, but quite often they would really like some help and support with that. So that's where we step in and take that over for somebody. That's a really, really big part of what we do.
This is the kind of thing that can happen to anyone. Anyone can fall victim to it, especially now that we are increasingly using the internet in our everyday lives. But is there a particular demographic of people that you tend to see more than others?
It absolutely can happen to anyone. We only deal with over 18s, but we certainly have had contact from under 18s, and we have dealt with clients in their 80s. So it does happen to anyone, but I suppose the majority of our clients are women. So that would be about 2/3 overall, and predominantly younger. I would say probably I usually say under about 35 is more typical, but absolutely it can be anyone. And yes, very, very distressed and distraught, and often, understandably, people often respond in a knee-jerk way. So often people will come to us and they'll say, "Well, I've deleted my Facebook, I've come off all social media, or I've inadvertently just deleted the evidence," which is a completely understandable response, but we do try and encourage people not to do that, or at least to stop and think before they do, to be sure that they're going to keep their options open.
I think it's understandable that when something like this happens, people's first instinct a lot of the time is to just try and get rid of the images as quickly as possible, delete them as quickly as they can. But does that ever lead to problems in the long run where it's actually difficult for you to get evidence of the crimes that have been committed?
Really big issue. Largely, certainly law enforcement in the UK don't really understand. They don't tend to understand how to collect evidence. Certainly that your frontline police officers that our victims are speaking to. Obviously, I think most forces have a cybercrime unit, but that tends to be separate as far as we can tell. And so the people that are being reported to, either when they're ringing 101 or if they've gone into police station or they've actually speaking to an officer, that officer doesn't necessarily understand how to collect evidence either directly from a device or by going to social media. Most social media platforms have law enforcement channels for collecting evidence, but there doesn't seem to be the familiarity with that. So often people will be told that screenshots aren't enough. Well, I'm told by a legal expert in this area that yes, screenshots are enough. So that there is a lot of conflict there, and it just creates confusion, certainly for victims. And yes, if we do remove stuff too quickly, then that can get in the way of a conviction. So we do always encourage people to take screenshots of evidence before any reporting starts. Then even if they don't want to go to the police straight away, they have got that option later on.
Do you think that this is an area where there's a big need for more training for police officers, so maybe they know how to collect evidence or respond to victims in a better way?
Yes, definitely. And not just for offences like this one, but across the whole range of online harassment. I think the reports that we get from our clients do suggest that the police officers that they're speaking to, and the majority of them, just don't understand how it works. And actually that there's a cultural lack of appreciation that somebody's online life is very much a part of their whole lives. There's still a perceived difference between the two, that online and offline are separate, and they're not. And for the majority of our clients, they're not. So I think there's a real cultural shift that needs to happen there.
Because this kind of crime involves technology, things are obviously always rapidly changing, things are advancing really quickly. Has that affected the law in this area? Do you think that the law is fit for purpose as it is at the moment?
No, it's really not fit for purpose at the moment. And I think while it was put together with good intentions, I think, in fairness, nobody knew how things were going to develop. And I don't think there was an appreciation of the need to future-proof in the way that clearly has been needed. There is a Law Commission consultation ongoing at the moment, which will be going into an open consultation phase, hopefully before Christmas. And we'll report to government sometime next year. And we have made representations to them about the amendments that we would like to see made, because there are some really big holes, and it does need to be made more robust so that it will, for exactly that reason about the technology, it'll just last a bit longer, because 5 years isn't very long, and it takes a long time to get legislation through Parliament. So even now we're still looking a couple of years away, and anything could happen. We know if you look at something like deepfakes, that's a technology that's changing really, really fast. So even though it's not something we're seeing directly yet, it's literally a matter of days or months or weeks before we do. And so that they need to think about that, and they need to think that as technology arrives, abusers are very, very quick to work out how to use something. They will think of it before the person trying to plug the gap. So you just have to try and make sure that it's as watertight as it can be against future developments.
There are different forms of intimate image abuse, and your website mentions a couple of them. Could you tell us a bit about them and what the common ones are? Specifically sextortion. What is sextortion, and is it common?
Sextortion is a very specific area that we deal with, and is quite different from most of the other work that we do, because it's very different dynamic. So what we class as sextortion, I think the National Crime Agency usually call it webcam blackmail. It's an activity usually operated by overseas criminal gangs, very commonly based in Morocco, the Philippines, Ivory Coast is another one. And essentially they're operating like call centres. And this is probably a dozen or two individuals sitting at like a call centre, banks of computers, and targeting person after person after person after person. And the dynamic is that somebody, usually a younger man, not always, often a younger man, is approached online, possibly on Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, lots of areas where they're approached by somebody that looks like a younger female and very flirtatious, moves off platform, possibly to Google Hangouts or possibly Skype, and moves on to sexual activity really very quickly. And then as soon as that's happened, then the blackmail starts, and it's, well, this has been recorded, we've already captured all your contacts from your Facebook or wherever they met, and they often share a screenshot of lists of contacts and say, well, if you don't pay now, then we're going to share that with your contacts, and that's, you know, potentially very, very devastating for people. So yeah, that's making up usually it's a fairly consistent 13% of our cases, but this year we've seen a real spike, and it's sort of below 20% now, but earlier in the year, certainly from lockdown. I think when lockdown started, lots of people at home, a lot of people on their own, using the internet to meet people, just to have some human contact. And unfortunately, in some cases, it turned out not to be what it seemed. So at the moment, it's running nearer 20% of what we're doing.
It's interesting that you describe it as being like a call centre, because I think that's quite different to the image that most people have of how this type of crime plays out. I think people think it's, you know, usually between partners where images are shared consensually at first and then they get taken and released without consent. But this almost sounds like it's more like a business.
That is, and I would say that is definitely quite a sort of a separate, the dynamic is very different, because actually the majority of what we're dealing with is between people that know each other, and a lot of it is former partners. But this particular thing, which is why we separate it out as sextortion, it's just a very different dynamic and a different profile of victims. Though we're seeing more women actually this year as victims, and it's interesting, it's a very different behaviour. So with men, the behaviour tends to happen over a matter of hours. It will go from first contact straight through to blackmail. And for women, it's much longer. I think in general, women seem less keen to go straight to online sexual activity when they've just met someone. So it tends to be a matter of days or weeks or months before it gets to that point. And there tends to be a belief on the part of the woman that this is potentially a genuine, serious relationship that they're building here. It's not a short-term sexual activity.
Another form of abuse that's mentioned on your website is upskirting. What is upskirting, and would you say it's quite a common thing that people are coming to you with?
Well, I think it is fairly common, but it's not something that we're really seeing because we're dealing it with when people's intimate images have been shared. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the victims don't know that this has happened. So somebody is taking some content of the victim, and it's hard to say what they're doing with it. Obviously, sometimes they're keeping it for themselves, but in other cases, we're seeing albums on adult sites which are labelled upskirting shots. So we know that it is being shared online. But unfortunately, until the victim comes to us and says, this is of me, there's nothing that we can do. And that virtually never happens, because I think most of the time women don't know that it's happened, and if they do know that it's happened, they don't know where it's been shared.
What are the most common platforms and websites that you see these images being shared on? And would you say that they're generally quite cooperative when you go to them for help removing them?
The majority of content is shared on adult sites. So we deal with most of the main adult sites, if you want me to name them. Social media do make up a bit of a chunk. I think I did some figures the other day, and it's adult sites are around about the 30% of where content has been shared, and we know where it is. So they're around about 30%, and then Facebook is around about 20, with Instagram around about 10. So Twitter's at quite a small proportion, though often content that's being hosted on an adult site can then be shared on Twitter as advertising for that site. So Twitter kind of sometimes gets involved, but often not directly. That it's more because it's being shared as to advertise hosting elsewhere. So that's the majority, and the rest would be quite a lot of emails and text message or private messaging platforms. So or we just don't know, because the client doesn't know where it is, unfortunately, and we can look for it, but only if the client has access to the content. Otherwise, of course, we don't know what it looks like, and if we don't know what it looks like, we can't find it. So so it's quite a mixed bag, but the vast majority of platforms are really cooperative. We've got really good relationships with all the social media platforms, most of whom have got policies, quite robust policies and procedures for working in this area and for removing content. And we've got escalation routes, so that we can, if there's an issue, or if often automated procedures don't work as they should, that we've got a route that we can get someone further up the line to just have another look and see whether they can take action for us. So that's really effective. Same applies really to adult sites. The really major adult sites are starting to make some really positive steps in this area. They've always been very cooperative for us, which is much appreciated. But they're actually starting to take some proactive steps, which early days, but it's really, really nice to see that there's a bit more goodwill in getting rid of this content, because they don't really want it on their sites. It causes them a lot of trouble. It's illegal. We don't want it there. The clients don't want it there. So we are very open to working with sites to make it be as effective as possible.
Unless it's the kind of situation where the victim's directly coming to you and saying, I'm in these images and I know who's released them, I can imagine that it's quite difficult to actually track down people. Is that quite a big barrier for you, is tracking down the perpetrators of these crimes?
Structured at the moment, because it's around an intention to cause distress is the requirement as it stands. So it's all about consent. So that's why we can't just wholesale take content down if we haven't been alerted to it by the client, because we need the client to say, this is me, I did not consent to this content to be shared. And then that's enough for us to make a request to have it taken down under UK law. And obviously, if they can't do that, or if we don't know that that content is a particular person, then we can't take it down, because we don't have a right to, because some people want to share that content of themselves, and that's fine, but it just means we don't have the legal leverage to make the request. Perpetrators, to be honest, most perpetrators are not particularly sophisticated, and they tend to use similar usernames across different platforms. And I think I suspect that if you were investigating that, you would be able to find them. I don't know that many have got the sophisticated tech skills to cover up IP addresses, or haven't given addresses to the platform, because on a legitimate mainstream adult platform, they will have user details and contact email addresses, and all of that information is available to law enforcement if they ask for it in the right way. And as I say, there are usually channels that law enforcement can do that if they've had the training to know how to go about it.
So from what you're saying, these aren't particularly sophisticated criminals. They might not know much more about computers than the average person would. So it's a little bit more training could really go a long way. But what more do you think needs to happen overall to prevent this kind of crime from happening?
Things we've just talked about. So that we need to see the law needs some serious amendment, but hopefully that is in a process that's already started. And we need training. We really, really need law enforcement training. And I mean, I do think there are some issues here with not just with the police, but also with charging decisions as well. It's the whole criminal justice train. It's very risk averse. I think it's suffered from a lot of funding cuts. So there is a reluctance to take things to court if they're not sure that they can get that conviction. And that means that some things don't go, and that if there isn't an understanding about collecting the evidence to make that possible, then the rest of the chain is going to collapse as well. So there definitely does need to be an investment in training, generally around online crime, but also around this particular offence and the impact that it has on people, which is the other thing that isn't understood.
Thank you for talking to me today, Sophie, and for telling us a bit more about what your organisation does. If anyone's interested, their website is revengepornhelpline.org.uk. And if you want to know more about cybercrime more generally, we have plenty of articles and videos on this website, so please do look around. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this Cybercrime Academy video podcast.